and we need to quit making excuses for Jesus being wrong. We need to look at the word honestly and see if what he said was right or wrong, instead of believing so-and-so said, or believing what we've been taught, or this is picture, it's representative of this, and this is illustrative of this. Welcome back, church. Well, we've been unpacking a big topic of eschatology, of end-time events, or what is understood to be end-time events, and we've been unpacking that already this week with the Olivet Discourse, and that is the greatest, as far as largest, passage that is recorded regarding prophecies after the New Testament time, outside of the book of Revelation, of course. So it is the largest passage. It is also one of the most recognizable as far as the verbiage used that he gave in telling of events that would come after his time. And so we've been unpacking that in detail, but we're unpacking it little by little here and there. And so I just want to illustrate right here and now that there were 3 questions, and the first 2 were related to the generation that was hearing him speak. So within this generation, all of these things would be fulfilled before the answer to this question. And so let's look at the even verbiage that he uses to kind of break this down, because I think that'll help us to see a little bit better with what he is dealing with as far as which question he's answering at which time. So he begins his discourse in verse 5, and he starts talking about false messiahs. So false messiahs would come. So again, the question we have to ask is, was Jesus crazy? Was he wrong? Was he accurate in saying that there would be false messiahs that come up after his pass, after he ascended into heaven? Well, yeah. John Wesley actually said that there was there was no time where there was a greater number of false messiahs that came up after Jesus' time. You can even think logically that, man, when Jesus was there, people were ready for the Messiah. They said, man, he's here, come and see him. It's here, it's gotta be Jesus. But after he died, a lot of those believers, they thought, man, I guess he wasn't the Messiah. Well, if he's not, there's gotta be somebody. So they were already teed up and ready for a Messiah to come and show. And there was, in fact, a great number of people who came in his name, as he said, and came saying, I am the Messiah, and built a following around the New Testament church. There was a great number. Again, John Wesley said that there was no time where there was a greater number of people that swelled up. Again, under the Roman rule, with the persecution of the Jewish nation, the heart cry was crying out for their coming Messiah. Their whole world in some ways revolved around this. And therefore, there were people who rose up to fill the void and say, well, you need a Messiah? I'll be your Huckleberry. That rose up saying, I am he. And they built a following of people around the subject of them being the coming Redeemer. There was a great number of false messiahs after Jesus ascended to heaven and before the destruction of Jerusalem, or before the generation timestamp has passed. So yeah, that was a warning sign. That definitely happened. So next he talked about wars and rumors of wars. So he talked about nation rising against nation. Well, during Jesus' time, there's what is called as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Now, to other nations, it might not have been as peaceful to being dominated and put, under subjugation. But at the same time, during the life of Jesus, there was peace in the empire. And just to give kind of a little bit of a preface and a counterbalance, you'll see that the perspective around Rome is, this is understood to be the civilized culture. Outside of Rome, everything is uncivilized. Inside of Rome, everything is civilized. Everything is stable. Everything is normal. Everything is business as usual. It was stable as could be. But until that time, and when Rome finally decimated Jerusalem, about a generation later, from between those times, there was nation rising against nation. There was tumult. There was wars and rumors of wars. In one 18-month period, what do you call them? So in one 14-month period, 4 emperors were violently murdered. There was civil war, and in AD 66, it grew in persecution and tumult to the point where 50,000 Jews in one city were slaughtered, and another city had 20,000 Jews that were slaughtered. All in this would have caused a lot of war rumor. When is the next uprising? When is the next revolt? What is going to happen next? This was chaos. And so all to say, wars and rumors of wars, did this happen, or was Jesus wrong? It happened, and it happened within a generation of those hearing his prophecy about it. So yes, that happened. Next, he talked about famines. So was there famines between the time he ascended and the end of that generation? Yeah, you can even see cited in the Bible. It was prophesied that a great famine was coming in the book of Acts. I believe it's around chapter 10. It was cited a great famine. But actually, one of the most vivid descriptions is Josephus himself, a historian, a Jewish historian, not a Christian, but a Jewish historian who was living at that time. And he said the famine was so great that people were pulling food out of each other's throats to eat. And that if somebody was holding on to food or suddenly had food, the men were beaten and the women had their hair ripped out of their heads trying to hold on to their food. Fathers and mothers were stealing food from their children, and the children were stealing it from their parents. It was not just we're going a little hungry, we got to tighten our belts. It was famine. Did this happen in the generation following the hearers? Yes, it did. Hallelujah. So again, as we're ticking these off, Jesus' words are coming to pass. We can see fulfilled, 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 fulfilled. This should be giving you a hope on the veracity and the validity of Jesus' word, that when he says it, he backs it up with everything he is, and all of heaven backs up his words. But instead of looking at these signs for the end of our life, we can look at them in past tense and say, man, everything he said happened just like he said it would. So now, what was the next one? He said earthquakes in diverse places. Did that happen? Well, just to kind of set the stage, at his death, there was an earthquake. And then at his resurrection, the Bible says there was another earthquake. Just a few verses later in Matthew 28, there was another earthquake that shook the tombs in Jerusalem. So yeah, there was earthquakes there. But then the historians even record that there was intense seismic activity leading right up to AD the year 70, which was when the fall of Jerusalem happened. There was intense seismic activity there. And one of the most outstanding was when Pompeii was destroyed in the early 60s. But all to say, did earthquakes happen leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem? Yes, it did. Hallelujah. Another prophecy fulfilled. So earthquakes, and then it says, but when you see these things, these are just birth pangs. And he said, that means these are the beginning. But I want to highlight that word that I touched on in a previous lesson. He kept saying these signs, but then he would say, but this is not the end. And that leads a lot of people to think he was talking about the end of the world, or in other words, the third question. But they're completely different words, and one can be used to define an end of time. This one that Jesus used is a different word, and it's never used in the Bible in relation to time. He wasn't talking about the end of something. He was talking about the fulfillment of what is being described. In other words, he was saying these are the beginning of birth pangs. And so he's saying, as bad as you think it is, there's more to come. As bad as you think it is, there's more. As bad as you think it is, there's more coming. Don't think it's over, and don't try to lay down and catch your breath yet. There's more. So, just to highlight the division between those two words that are translated end. The one is the question, when is the end of the world, that the disciples asked? But as he's talking about the signs in the next few verses through 5 through 35, when he's talking about the end, he's talking about the fulfillment of what he is describing. The judgment raining down, the desolation of the Jewish, not nation or people, but Jerusalem and the temple, the old religious structure. It is not yet the end. So birth pangs, that's not really a sign. He was talking about observance and how you process it. And he was warning them, these things are gonna lead up to the end. One thing I really enjoy about looking at the flexibility of prophecy is Jesus, he described that these things would happen. He knew they would happen within a generation, but he didn't seem to know what time in the year they would happen. He said, moreover, you should pray that it doesn't happen in winter or on a Sabbath. So that means that was up in the air, and their prayers could affect what day it would fall on. So he was saying, let me put something in your arsenal. Pray these two things, because it's going to be terrible if it falls on a Sabbath or if it falls in winter. And woe to the nursing mothers in that time, because they'll wish that they didn't bring a baby into this world while suffering under these things. I mean, again, this was heinous. If you want a detailed picture of what this looks like, then get the book of Josephus covering wars, and it'll describe what exactly happened. It was so heinous that I almost don't even want to describe it in case there's children listening, but there was so much blood in the streets that Josephus said that they were putting out fires in houses with the blood of men that was flowing in the streets. I mean, it was awful. It was something that they'd never seen prior. They were stacking dead bodies to clot the streets and keep people from moving through. It was awful. And so all that to say, this is what he was describing leading up to. It was the judgment that would fall. And again, to use the verbiage in Daniel as well as around the abomination that causes, it was the desolation of the city, to leave it desolate. So we're going to continue next time talking about the other signs that he's going to flow through. And we'll talk about that. But the question again is, did these things happen within a generation? And we've seen again and again, yes, 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 yes. And we need to quit making excuses for Jesus being wrong. We need to we need to look at the word honestly and see if what he said was right or wrong, instead of believing so-and-so said, or believing what we've been taught, or this is picture, it's representative of this, and this is illustrative of this, that, and the other. No, if it wasn't a parable, then what he said was to be taken at value. Otherwise, how do you trust a man who, out of one side of his mouth, he's saying lies, and the other, he's giving, truths? No. Jesus is right. He is true. He didn't lie. He wasn't wrong. And we need to see him for what he is, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. But I'll get into the rest of the signs next time, and I'll see you there. Hey friends, Jake here. We're going to continue unpacking, understanding the Olivet Discourse and understanding how it fits within the end time prophecies that Jesus gave. So with last time, we saw the three questions, and we helped to understand the formulation of these questions in the disciples' heart as they asked Jesus, because Jesus gave this prophecy in the next couple of chapters with parables and illustrations. He gave these prophecies, and he gave them in answer to their questions. So we not only have to understand what the questions were, but what they were formed in, what they were based on, because then we can fully understand what Jesus was addressing, what he's answering and when, and we can also begin to see the outline form of the Olivet Discourse instead of just drawing from it one message that is not one message. It was answering three separate questions, and we have to understand that. So we're going to talk, just as an introduction, we're going to highlight the three questions specifically. In Matthew, it highlights them. It says in chapter 24, verse 3, we have the three questions listed. The disciples said, when will these things happen? And once again, as we covered last time, that was the judgment of Jerusalem and the judgment of the temple and the destruction of that temple. So we have, when will these things happen? That's what they were asking. And then they said, what will be the sign of your coming? And what they were asking there was, they were saying, Jesus, we know you're the Messiah, and we know the Messiah is come to reign and to deliver us. What will be the sign of you sitting down on that throne and being made king? What will be the sign of your coming? And then lastly, they said, and what will be, and unpack the end of the world. Tell us more about that. Help us to understand what to look for in that. So those were the three questions. So as Jesus begins to unpack this, there's a kind of division into two big parts. Now, I say that just kind of as an overarching statement, but you can see the two parts divided when we look more at the signs in detail, which we will toward the end of this week. But as you look at the signs themselves, Jesus, he begins giving signs. He says, this is going to happen, that is going to happen. Don't worry, don't let your heart be scared. This is going to happen, that will go. He said these things, and then he even gave a timeline as far as where the signs are hitting. He said, okay, but when you see these, don't worry. The end of the judgment is not actually coming. And so he actually even gave a timeline. These are the beginning of the birth pains, but the end of that coming judgment is not here yet. But then you see the big delineating, dividing line between the first two questions being answered and the last question being answered. And it was with the phrase that says, heaven and earth will pass away, my words will never pass away. And he said, prior verse, this generation will not pass away until all of these things be fulfilled. You can even see that dividing line further reinforced when Jesus goes into saying, in chapter 24, he goes into saying, but of that day. Usually when it says that day or the day of judgment, it speaks of the final coming judgment of the Son of God to judge all of mankind in our life in this earth, the day of judgment before everything else kicks off. So when he said, but of that day, meaning the end of the world, but of that day, he said, there's no sign. It'll be like a thief in the night. You be watchful, you be ready, you be prepared, you do this, that, and the other. He said, but of that day, there's not a sign. And you'll notice, again, just to highlight with clarity so that we can all stay on the same page, this sign will precede it, then this sign will precede it. This happens. When you see this, don't let your heart be scared. This is coming. These things had to happen, but it's not yet the end of this first question. It's not yet the end, but this has to happen. And then he flows into, but of that day, there's not going to be any sign, no warning, no sign. It'll be like a thief in the night. Who plans for that? No sign. So you can see this big dividing line between answering the first two questions, which Jesus connected with that generation living in his hearing there, and the end of all things, the end of the world. So once we see that big dividing line, we can begin to see what answers what. What is for our future, the end of all things, and what was for the generation that was alive back then. Because I want to just say, first of all, and as strongly as I can put it, just, with literal verbiage, in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus pronouncing judgment on the temple, he said, this generation won't pass away till judgment comes. You're going to see this. And then after he tells of all the signs that are coming prior to that judgment and prior to his coming into his kingdom, then he puts another end cap, almost sandwiching the two together, saying, but this generation will not pass until you see all of these things fulfilled. So there's one huge takeaway that we can take from this, and that is either Jesus was wrong or it happened as he said. And we can see that not all of this Olivet discourse was for the end of all things when the world gets purged and raptured, when it gets enveloped in flame, when Jesus comes back to reign on this earth. That's not about chapter 24 and 25. There's a big dividing line, and again, Jesus wasn't answering the third question from the outset to the finish. He was answering the first one. And so all that to say, now that we've established that a great part of this Olivet discourse was talking about what would take place in the disciples' generation, then we can begin to see that some of these signs are not something that we are to be watching for and waiting for today. There's no way to argue that unless you are mixing in man's reasoning, man's teaching, and what we have been taught to believe against what Jesus said here. Because again, there's no real good way to dance around it without just covering it with a blanket and making assumptions throughout. I can see also why it's confusing because of different words used. For instance, in verse 3 of chapter 24, the disciples said, and of the end of the age, and of the end of the world. And then as Jesus starts giving signs in verse 5, 6, and 7, he says, okay, this is going to happen, that'll happen, false messiahs, wars and rumors of wars, nation will rise against nation, earthquakes in diverse places, and famines. And he said, but when you see these things take place, it is not yet the end. So that leads people to believe that he's saying, okay, these are signs of what's coming up, but it's not yet the end of the world, so to speak. But that's not what this was talking about. The first question was about the judgment on the temple and the judgment on Jerusalem, which was prophesied. In Luke, in this discourse, it even says that this is the day of vengeance where all things that are written must be fulfilled. So he's talking about something happening in their generation, and he's saying there's still things that have to happen to fulfill all of the prophecies that have come before. And so all this to say, one thing that's clear: the word used when it says the end of the world is a different word than Jesus said, these are just the beginning. It is not yet the end. He used a completely different word. And if you look at that word, it's the word telos. That word is actually not even used in relation to time. You don't use that word when you're saying the end of time. The time is fulfilled. It actually was saying it's the last stage in, like, let's say, a project. It is the culmination of things, events. And so you could even put it into Luke's words, where all things that are written may be fulfilled. Jesus was saying, but it is not yet the end. What he was saying there was, this is not the fullness of judgment. In other words, what he was saying was, as bad as this is, there's more to come. It's not going to let up. There's more that is going to happen. That's what he was warning of when he was giving the signs and saying, but it is not yet the end. He was saying, as bad as it is, as heinous as it looked, when you think it can't get any worse, don't be deceived. There's more coming. That's what he was saying. So I can understand why it could be easy to be swept into all the verbiage of saying, oh, this is the beginning, but it's not yet the end. This is the beginning, but it's not yet the end. But he wasn't associating this with the third question. What he was saying was, this is not the final stage of the coming judgment on this holy city. And so you're going to understand that more as we unpack the signs toward the end of this week, and as we unpack exactly what Jesus said, and then seeing if he was wrong or if it was fulfilled the way he said it would be. Because he didn't use unclear verbiage. He didn't use soft, nebulous with a lot of gray area terms. He said very clearly exactly what would come. And we have to take him at his word and not just put a blind stamp of faith on it and believe it because he said it. We need to look and see how these things could have been proven true. Because again, the takeaway from it is that either he was wrong or they happened. And I want to show you they happened, and we'll see with more clarity how that looks. But join me next time. We're going to talk about one of the biggest misunderstood points in this initial discourse, and that is the abomination that causes desolation. So we're going to unpack that tomorrow. And I look forward to getting into that, because that's also going to help to frame and set the stage as to why all these things were written and had to take place. So I look forward to doing that next time. Join me there, but share this video if it meant anything to you. Click the notification bell so you're notified, so that you can continue to build this worldview and get a biblical understanding of these prophecies and see what Jesus meant when he said them, who they were directed toward, and what we are to take away from them. Hallelujah. But I'll see you next time, church. Bless you.